Give me in.
Your church records, which leads us to believe that it's the.
Oh, a lot of people endowed certain chairs, actually.
I know what pews are.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, in terms of the new church.
Yeah. So that, I wonder if that was the third meeting house.
It is. The one that opened
Because
in
this one's
1710.
1810.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is the 17.
I wonder what led from that one, from the third to the fourth. I don't know.
So there isn't a new building built between 1718, right? And this one. And so, is it another church that's in another place in Rehoboth? Is it? But it's in your records. And then lastly, here we have one of the earliest documents, 1687. So these are the receipts of Reverend Samuel Andrews.
So those are handwritten. I want to go.
They are. Everything is handwritten.
What do they receive the receipts for?
My name is Jeff Green, and I'm the Minister of Music here at Newman Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this lecture. We'll get the lecture one. Come right in, folks. Followed by the concert at 3 o'clock in the Meeting House. And we have 3 speakers for you today that we're very excited to have. Linda Coombs, Rebecca Smith, and Nancy Godfrey. And just a couple of introductory remarks, folks. We've had a year-long celebration of Newman's 375th anniversary, which we share with the town of Rehoboth, because both were born with the single act of Samuel Newman striking a deal with Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoags in 1643, and this is the first settlement on the East Bay. In fact, it was not part of either the Mass Bay Colony or the Plymouth Colony when it was founded. And so it's been a year of education, a year of learning and exciting exploration. And I had actually no intention of putting together a lecture when we started this. It was all about a concert. And so we started doing all kinds of reading and research. And we, at the urging of Consuelo Sherba and Chris Turner, I applied for a grant from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. As a way, we thought it would be really neat to have a full session dedicated to the history itself. And that gave birth to this lecture. It's so great to see you all here, folks. And so we're so delighted to explore how this congregation and how this town of Rehoboth came into being. And not only how it came into being in 1643, but talk about what we're doing today at Newman and kind of everything in between. Because the more you learn about this, the more you realize this is really not just the story of Newman Church or the story of Rehoboth, but it's the story of America. You know, it's really the story of New England. It's the story of the founding of this country, and it's amazing. The more you learn, the more you want to learn. I know I do, and I'm so excited to hear from our speakers today. I'll let each one of them talk about whether or not they want to take questions as we go or not, but I do want to encourage all of you, when this ends, there is a survey that's here, and I'm going to pass them out actually toward the end, because part of the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities gift includes, they asked us, how do you measure success? And one of the things that we know is successful, that, wow, the room's full. So thank you all for coming. But we'd love your feedback. We'd love to know what you liked, what you didn't like, what we could have done more of, what we could have done less of. My hope today with this whole event is that we actually form some kind of a relationship with the Wampanoags. And I've been working with Kitty Hendricks. And our great hope is to have the Wampanoag singers and dancers come back to Newman Church in a year to do a participatory dance performance and learn more about their culture and explore that. We are so thankful to the Rhode Island Historical Society and Morgan Greff, who have a full table of display. If you don't mind giving up just a little for the Rhode Island Historical Society. Thank you, Morgan. We're so thankful to the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, who gave a grant to make today possible. I want to point out in the Carpenter Museum, and I want to thank Rebecca Smith from the Rehoboth Antiquarian Society. Thank you. In the Brown case, which the Carpenter Museum let us borrow, is one of the printings of the Concordance from 1643 that Samuel Newman wrote and sent to England to be printed. That's on special display from Dr. Bill Brown and Mara Brown, and we're so thankful to them for letting us see that today. So make sure you make time. This will go about an hour, and then the concert's at 3, so there's a good 45 minutes in there to check out all these amazing things, all of Nancy's artwork, the maps on the wall. There'll be a brief reception right after this. So again, thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Linda Coombs from the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me now? Yes. Okay. Yes, I'm from the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead Aquina, and but I live in Mashpee, and I've lived there for over 40 years, so I tend to confuse a lot of people. And they say, well, if you live in Mashpee, how come you're not a Mashpee Indian? Well, it's not my nationality. That's why. If you moved there, you wouldn't be one either. You would stay who you are, you know, all of that stuff. The year 1643 kind of caught my attention, especially in regard to the topic of Christianity. And just as a warning or a spoiler alert or whatever, I am going to be talking about some of the processes of colonization, which is pretty tough history, okay? But in 1643, that is when the first native person in this entire area was converted to Christianity. And he was a man named Coombs, who was from the Chappaquiddick tribe, Chappaquiddick being an island off of Martha's Vineyard. And in reading about him, it just seems like, you know, like the English approached him and said, hey, you want to convert to Christianity? And it seemed like he was like, yeah. Sounds good, whatever. And it's just this weird reaction. I mean, I thought it was weird because, but you have to consider what had happened prior to 1643. You know, I was looking at all of this up just briefly. I didn't like sit and, you know, read every word or whatever. But I noticed that it's all, we are not represented in that anywhere. And in 1643, we were still here, as we were through every other time period. But that's the type of thing that takes us out of history if we're not mentioned. So I'm trying to just put us back. But between 1616 and 1618, and there's, you know, at least the map over there shows part of the area that I'm talking about, there was a huge plague that swept down from Maine, and it basically wiped out 4 tribes in its path as it came down the coast, including the Wampanoag. We numbered roughly 70,000 people. I was just telling Jeff that our territory, or at least all the Wampanoag-speaking people, went from like Gloucester, Mass. And if you could picture a map in your mind, and you see Route 495, you go from Gloucester down 495 and down to Narragansett Bay. That was all the Wampanoag-speaking people, including the Cape and the Islands. And we had 69 villages, numbered roughly 70,000 people. And we lost anywhere from 75 to 90% in that first plague. And yet, when you read subsequently into the 1630s and 40s and 50s, there's a wonderful book that just came out last winter, Our Beloved Kin, A New Look at King Philip's War. There was one Englishman, I can't remember his name, but he managed to secure a certain amount of land in Weedemo's territory in what is now the Fall River. It was our village of Pecasset. And other English people were wanting to spread out like that, but a lot of times they were afraid, apparently, to walk on the roadways, on the paths, or whatever. Because every time they did, they saw Indians. Just walking back and forth, hunting, going from one village to another, going fishing, whatever, just living their lives. You know, and so clearly there was still a lot of people around, okay? But getting back to Coombs, and you notice in my last name, we think that Coombs is the man that the name Coombs with the Wampanoag comes from. And my husband one time, because we are not Christians, he said to me, you know, what do you think? Change the name back to Coombs? And I was like, well, he was the first guy to be converted to Christianity, you know, and he was like, oh. So that would be cool. And Joel Hyakkum's son, Joel, was one of the first Indians to go to Harvard when it was established as an Indian school in 1650. And he actually died a month before graduation. And Harvard at that time refused to give him his degree, even though he had completed his coursework. So Joel Hyakkum did receive his degree posthumously in 2011. And it was given to a young woman, Tiffany Smalley from Aquinnah, who was graduating in that year, as well as to my brother-in-law, Bernard Coombs, who's the elder in our family now. So they each got a copy of Hyakkum's degree. Better late than never, right? But, you know, a lot of times, you know, people think, you know, and I think that the plague had a lot to do with Hyakkum's response, as near as I can figure thus far. I'll put that qualification in. Because that was so devastating. I cannot imagine what it must have been like to watch village after village, you know, everyone in this village just die, and the knowledge of and everything that the people had go with it, and whole families, whole clans, entire communities just gone within a 2-year span. So even this is like 25 years later with him, it's like it had to just be such an impact. You know, it was just there hanging over them. So I think that had a lot to do with his response. And even so, he actually became a pastor himself. And at one point went back to Chappaquiddick, and they were going to talk to the sachem, or the chief of the Chappaquiddick people. And he went with these two white ministers, and when the sachem saw him, he ran up and punched him right in the face and knocked him on the ground. Because a lot of times you think, oh, the Indians accepted Christianity and then everybody got along and it was just wonderful, and we had turkey on Thanksgiving. Can't forget that part, right? So there's just a lot of misunderstanding about the history. And clearly, this sachem was not happy with the whole thought of converting people to Christianity. And he and many others recognized that with the acceptance of Christianity, we will lose our own way of life. And we did have a spiritual way. Okay. I was noticing, I was looking on the website of the church where I came, and it mentions the doctrine of discovery. And I don't know if people have heard of that, or how many have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Okay, see, 2 hands, 3, 4 including mine. Oh, okay. What that is, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see that, because as we've just seen, most people do not know what that is. In the 15th century, 1452 in this case, the Vatican issued a series of papal bulls, which I think means like bulletins, as opposed to, you know, some other reference to that. Kind of ends up being the same thing. Sorry. It could get worse, but I'll try to. And what this one particular papal bull said was that Christian people can go anywhere in the world to where there are non-Christians living, and you can enslave them, you can kill them, you can take their land, you can take the resources that are on the land, you can do anything you want, because they're not really human as non-Christians. And Google it if you don't believe me, because it'll read. So let's see. And that whole idea, the whole concept behind the doctrine of discovery, has been incorporated into the body of U.S. law. Okay? So think about that one for a minute. And when I was writing that down, it made me think of, you know, years ago I saw a census from Aquinnah. It was from, I'm not sure the year, it was in the 19th century anyway, and I don't know, let's say it was 1870. And so they have all the names, and they have the occupation, and they have the race of the person, which was just a little column, and you wrote I for Indian in this case. Well, 10 years later, you know, you could look, you see most of the same names. Some people may have died, or they may have just not been there to get recorded that time, or whatever. Most of the same names. All of a sudden, B for black. Miraculously, all these people just switched their whole ethnicity in a decade. And I was talking with someone about that recently, because it wasn't Aquinnah, it was another place where they had seen a census that did the same thing. And there are books written on the power of the pen, and what the pen can do and the damage it can cause. And the reason that it's handy for Indians to be not Indian, whether they're black or mulatto or colored or whatever word was used in that time period, all of these other people do not have the same relationship to the land that we do, because everyone came from someplace else. Another thing I watched on the web was a little video thing discovered or stolen about the boarding schools. I don't know if people saw that. It was very powerful. But it's talking about the, in this case, Lakota people in South Dakota. And the whole boarding school issue is huge now. That people, I mean, a few years ago, I met a 20-year-old college student from Alaska, and her family was a mess because her dad went to a boarding school and suffered all types of abuse and was an alcoholic and whatever. So that's, you know, it's still going on. It's very close. It's right here, you know. And my response to that is, you don't have to go to South Dakota or Minnesota or Pennsylvania. You could stay right here and learn about boarding schools. Because anything that happened to any Indian tribe from this point on westward happened to the tribes out here on the coast first. That's where the boats came in. They don't have too much beachfront property in South Dakota. And I figure, you know, that we were like the template for a lot of these things, because one of the things that the English did with us was to indenture our children, believing that English families could raise a native child better than their own parents. Because, of course, their own parents, remember, aren't all human, and they're backward and primitive and savages and all that stuff. And if you read some of the 17th century sources, there are some writers that say they were without art and science and brains, and, you know, when God passed out brains, the Indians thought he said trains, and they missed theirs, you know, that one. I mean, I'm being silly, but it's really that bad, you know. But children, and sometimes if a native family had 5 or 6 children, they may have to indenture out the oldest one, because that was the only way that they could keep their family together and keep the other children. And what would happen is that sometimes children from Rhode Island, like from Narragansett or something, were indentured out on Martha's Vineyard or out at the end of the Cape or way off, you know. No way they can get home if they run away. And this was wholesale. It wasn't just in isolated incidences, but it was wholesale. And, you know, same thing. When children are taken and put in these boarding schools, instead of boarding schools, they were just going into family homes, and then somebody must have said, hey, let's just do it, and do them in a bunch in a school instead of one child or whatever to a family. But they lose a connection with their family, with their community, with their language, with their customs, with the knowledge of the land. So much gets taken away. And that was the point, to take the Indian out of the people. But what they don't realize, you know, I think a lot of times when people think of Indians, and I still get this, things are getting better. Years ago, people used to ask me, don't you see things getting better? I mean, I've worked in museums for 40 years and answered people's questions, and I get the same questions, and I say, no, because we still ask the same questions, but nowadays it is getting a little different. I work with teachers. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work for them, because they want to hear the history and they're not afraid of it. You know, so it's quite wonderful, because they want the kids to have the truth, And then we have discussions about how do you teach a second grader about King Philip's War, you know, and things like that. So it's very different. They don't think of us as nations, nations of people, the Wampanoag Nation, the Narragansett Nation, the Nipmuc Nation. And we had a governmental structure, a community structure, social structure, family structures, clan systems, and all of this was based on kinship and relationship. And today, a lot of times you'll hear Native people today say, you know, the proper way to introduce yourself is to say what clan you're from. We cannot do that because we have lost that knowledge. But first thing, when you meet a Wampanoag person, if you say you're Wampanoag and we don't know you, what family are you from? Oh, we're from Hendricks in Mashpee. Oh, all right. Yeah, I met your grandmother. You know, so it's kind of the same thing, just lives on in a different form. And our relationship is not just within our community. It's not just community to community or nation to nation. I was noticing again on the website there's a page on racial justice, and all of the terminology, I mean, it was great stuff, but all the terminology, all the references are all regarding people and the treatment of people by other people. One critical element is missing. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to what that might be?
Nations and cultures?
No, because that has to do with people. The earth.
Land.
And not just land, but earth, in sort of in a total. I don't know if that makes sense. But our relationship with the earth was based on original instructions. And there, speaking of books, there's a book by that title that's absolutely wonderful. It's pretty simple. It's back at the beginning, when the Creator made the world and made everything and everybody. He gave each creation a different set of original instructions. Grass has their original instruction, bears, deer, water, wind, cows, humans. Guess who's the only one that's not living according to their original instructions? And it's real simple. Creator, you know, he sat us down and he said, look, I've made this whole world with all these beautiful trees and clean water and air and wind and grass and animals and birds. Your job as humans is to keep it as I've created it. You can take what you need, but here's the handbook of how you take what you need so that you don't deplete it. Okay? And it's like, you know, a lot of times people go, oh yeah, we're caretakers or stewards. And those words bother me because they imply separateness. If you take care of something, like I can take care of this podium, but it's separate from me. Okay, I can steward it, but it's still something separate from me. We're not separate from the world, the natural world that the Creator made. We're just part of it, with our place in it and our instructions. Okay, we're part of the whole. So we need to relearn, I guess, our right relationship. If you read about Native Americans, you might read that term, right relationship. And that relationship frames everything that we do. It tells us how to develop our culture and how to live on the land. Okay? I guess I'm in book mode today because another one I'd like to recommend is called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she has a chapter in that book called The Honorable Harvest. And if you are, for example, a deer hunter, and you're taking the deer's life, okay, because remember, that deer is no different from you or from me or anyone else. It has a life. Does that deer want to die? You can ask a 4-year-old that, and they're like, they get it. It's just in us, right? And so our responsibility to the deer, if we want their life so that we can eat, we can make our clothing, we can make our tools, whatever we use the animal for, our responsibility is to keep the deer's world what it needs to support its life. It's our responsibility to keep that in place. Okay? And in my years of, and I've heard it said that environmental justice is the same thing as human justice, or justice for humans, if you're talking about racial equality. It's the same thing. And in my years of being a historian, I've come to realize or to believe that everyone, every person, all of us, each one of us, are responsible for history. And years ago you say that, well, this happened to the Indians, but it wasn't my fault because my family hadn't come over yet. Yeah, right, okay, whatever. And maybe that's true. And maybe you or your ancestors were not responsible for what happened in the past. Okay? Kind of a little late for that anyway. But you're responsible for knowing what did happen. Okay? And the fact that it happened. What its elements are. Okay? I was reading the press release that the title of which is On This Land, which is something that I kind of take like literally. So I think that all of our responsibility is to know everything that happened on this land, that this building sits on, that your feet, when you go out the door, hit that ground. We need to know everything that happened. Not just some of it, but all of it. Because then you can sort of line it up and you get it in a fuller, more appropriate context. That's the responsibility or the obligation of each and every person. And that's no matter what ground your feet walk on. I had a girl, I used to work at Plymouth Plantation, and the woman who was the colonial food historian, one day she said to me, and she knows the history, she knows all the stuff that went down that wasn't good, and people dying in plagues, and being enslaved, and whatever. And she said, something, and she goes, but I'm really fine with that. Living here where all that happened, I'm just fine with that. And she was sort of nonchalant, very blithe about it, and I was like, if I went to Afghanistan, the last thing I would be blithe. I'm in someone else's place. And I deserve them, they deserve that respect from me, that acknowledgement that this is their place. And maybe I don't know the history of what happened. Some of the best advice I ever got in life, keep your eyes and your ears open and your mouth shut. So that comment kind of bothered me because there's too much blitheness about the way that history is told and received, and I think it's time, we're getting ready for 2020, we're preparing for this huge celebration, Plymouth 400 and the whole thing, 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower. If we can do that, then America can face its own real history, okay? Ohiesa, or Charles Eastman. I was going to say part of it, that's somebody else. And he was Dakota, from Minnesota, South Dakota, in 19th, early 20th century. And some of the stuff that I think it was his great-granddaughter was relating, because she was, researching her grandfather. And it's like different tribe, different territory, same story. I've talked with Indians from Alaska, from the West Coast, and about 2 words into it, we're on the same page because we have the same history. A little bit different, you have an indenture in a family and set up a boarding school, but the same thing is going on. So I think it's very important to remember that we need to relearn, either remember, because sometimes it's in us, you just have to bring it back out, or sometimes you have to relearn it, our original instructions. Because if we do that, remember our relationship to the earth, because that was a key thing with indigenous cultures, wherever they are in the world, then history will not repeat itself. When I was writing that, that was just this morning, and I was like, I think history's getting tired of hearing its own voice, saying the same thing over and over, So let's hear something different. Because then true equality will be created. So thank you. And if anyone has any questions,
I have a question.
yeah.
My grandfather's middle name was Coombs. I don't know that he was descended from Indian. He supposedly was born in Rochester, Mass. We've never been able to find him. Is that the name?
I mean, it's
Not a
Coombs.
common name.
Yeah, it's fairly common, and, there were Coombses, this higher Coombs that I was talking about was from Chappaquiddick, but the Coombses today are in Mashpee, but the Coombs name was found in Aquina, and I would suspect it would be found in other Wampanoag communities as well. Just depends, yeah. Yep.
You mentioned Hendricks. Was that an Indian name at all? My husband's family was Hendricks.
No,
There's no Indian blood there. No, any
I
connection?
mean, we got these English names, or I think Hendrick is actually German, either being indentured or taking a name, an English name. Because like I was saying, like there was this man Hyakuls, and his son was Joel Hyakuls. So they took his dad's first name and made it a surname. And then later, at some point in time, it got shortened without the Haya, because they, I don't know, maybe they get tired of waving to people. But and that's how it went. There was a book written in 1727, Indian Converts, which refers to the Indians of Martha's Vineyard in the process of converting them. And he's mentioning John, Indian name, Caleb Ohama, all these biblical or English first names with a native last name. And there were so many of them, I just started to write them down, and it just changed. And it's really funny because there's a family on Aquina, and their family is Manning, which of course is not a Wampanoag name, but it is one of the Wampanoag family names now. But they trace their heritage back to a family called Hawaswi, which is totally a Wampanoag name. And a couple of years ago, I was talking with a friend of mine from the Mashpee tribe. And, and I was talking about, people ask you, what family you're from and all that. If you get two Wampanoags together for very long, the next thing you're discussing who's related to who and what your family is. You're trying to go back 14 generations. And, so she and I got into that conversation. And she goes, well, she says, we're really Hawaswis anyway. You could have knocked me over with a feather. That she was coming up with a name that I thought was just in Aquina. And either it was in Mashpee too, or she's referring to some relationship there, which I don't know. So, research project. There was a question here.
Yeah, my significant other's last name is Coombs, spelled the same way. And he's from Maine originally, and when he was in college, the Penobscot land settlement was going on.
Oh, yeah.
And he and his father were enough Penobscot that they were, given an option to opt into the land settlement.
Wow.
So, I guess I had always thought that the Coombs name, I hadn't realized the Coombs name was the Penobscot name.
Okay.
I had thought it was an English name.
I don't know anything about it being in Penobscot. I mean, it is, as just Coombs, it is an English name.
Right, but I mean,
But
it's very,
how it
I'm
came-
just saying it's very possible, I had always made the assumption that the Coombs came from an English side.
Oh, I
But
see,
he was
yeah.
part of the Penobscot land settlement.
Yeah. And like I said, during the whole process of conversion, people were given English names or whatever as well, you know.
So it's very possible the Coombs came from the Penobscot side, not from the English side.
Could be. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say, thank you for bringing us the truth. It makes, parts of it, I just need to say, makes me profoundly sad. I need to keep working through that into what can I do today. Because your story is not the way I was raised, cowboys and Indians, etc. For me, my whole life since I was a teenager was trying to learn what really came down. But one of the things I just want to talk to you about a little bit is the idea of private property. Like, and this is a very simplistic view. People came over from Europe, they had a concept of private property. Am I oversimplifying to say how exploitive that could be when Indians didn't even have that? So to say, in other words, you're giving me this, they didn't even comprehend this. Am I right? Am I right?
Yeah.
That's what to me is at the heart of what's blowing my mind. They didn't even get what private property is. I mean, you know what I mean? In the same context,
Well,
certainly. Oh boy, we've got this now. We give them some beads. Hey, get this.
Yeah.
Now you get the hell out of the lane. And they go, what are you talking about? Get off.
Yeah.
Am I
No, you
oversimplifying?
nailed it, because
Okay.
Native
That's
people,
profoundly hurtful.
I mean, we had boundaries. So
Right.
between, you know, Pokanoket and Pocasset and whatever, Aquina or Takami, there were boundaries. And, but still, we believe that land could not be owned because it was made by the Creator, and you can't own it any more than you can own a chunk of water or a chunk of air, which, you know, today you can.
We'll stay away from today for right now.
Yeah, but that was the belief, and that, but, you know, if you wanted to go hunting in someone else's territory, you know, you went and you asked the sachem. You didn't just barge, you know, there were protocols in place, you know. And the English didn't understand any of that, and they came over here, and that whole belief system of theirs was extremely disruptive to our way of life, because we, like Pokanoket, like I was reading in somewhere that it meant the place of cleared fields, which it does. And according to our linguist, not just Wampanoag, but Narragansett, Pequot, you know, whomever, people utilize that land to plant on, you know, by some agreement with each other. But essentially, each one of the villages that I was mentioning had a spot within its boundaries where there was a winter village, where people summered and had planting fields, which are an acre or two per family, where there was hunting or fishing or berrying or whatever. You know, and if you needed to go into someone else's territory, there's ways that you could do that. And that's how we lived on the land. And, you know, and if you were picking blueberries and you walk into a field, you see this huge bush filled with blueberries, you went by that one and went to the next one. You know, but the English, first of all, they wanted our land and they were putting up fences. You know, oh, well, we bought this. We gave you a beaver coat, 2 brass pans, and a bullet or whatever. And so we own it. And you can't come on it now. So that was a disruption. Later on, they formed, you know, reservations or praying towns throughout the area. And in those areas, Native families were allotted certain parcels of land, 60 acres or whatever it was. Okay, and the English also believed that men should be farmers, where in our traditional culture it was the women. So they were, and literally it was convert or die. And if you were a Christian Indian, you were a good Indian. If you wanted to remain a traditional Indian, you were a bad Indian. That's a little simplistic maybe, but basically that's it. And that whole system of allotment totally messed up the way that we use the land. Okay? Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to comment on Hayek's conversion. You characterized it as being fairly casual, and Native Americans do not have a category of religion. Their lives are very spiritual, as you know. Everything is infused with spirituality. So a little later, Indians were converted more aggressively, were made to renounce their gods and their spiritual life. But when Hayekums was converted, I suspect for him it didn't really mean giving up his Indian spirituality. It just meant doing something to benefit the English, which may have given him some benefits or whatever. But I don't think he probably renounced his native identity, which included what we would call religion.
I'll tell you what happened. When that plague hit and it wiped out so many people, everything that we knew how to do, medically, physically, spiritually, any other way, economically, any way you could think of, did nothing to turn that plague away and that devastation happened. It caused a lot of our people to doubt our own ways. Okay? So there was a huge damage there. And that's why, one of the reasons that I think that Hayekums just rolled over so easy and became a Christian. Because he thought, well, our ways didn't work, let's try this one. Because it seemed like at the time that the English were stronger or superior or whatever the right word is.
What caused the plague?
It was, all we know was brought over by French
So it was coming
from Europe, yeah. Is there a hand in the back?
Yeah, you didn't know if it was smallpox?
Yeah, this one was not smallpox. Smallpox did come later.
And did it affect the colonists as much as the native people?
Well, this was prior to the settlement of Plymouth.
Oh, all right, yes, sorry.
So,
Yeah.
no, in their case, they didn't get in touch with that. Because when they landed in Plymouth, they were literally looking at broken down houses, overgrown cornfields, and bones bleaching. Because when people died, when they contracted this illness, they were dead within a couple of days. So there was no one left to bury the dead. No one to take care of the sick, no one to bury the dead. If there were any survivors, they just packed up and left. And sometimes if they could, if they had the manpower, they would burn the houses where people died, but it doesn't seem like that happened. Because Squanto used to take the English on trading voyages heading north, up to Maine, and they'd go for miles and see these, bones bleaching and overgrown cornfields and broken houses and everything because of the devastation of that plague. It was just shocking.
Should probably move on.
Yeah.
This has been amazing, Linda. Can I ask that, maybe it'd be good if I can get some of the list of the books and references you've
Okay.
made, and what I'd like to do is put them on the Newman website, and so that folks can come back and get some of these references, because you've given us so much things to think about, so much future reading to do. I know we were over.
That's your homework, I'll check with you next time.
Thank you very, Rebecca Smith from the Rehoboth Antiquarian Society. Thank you.
On behalf of the Rehoboth Antiquarian Society, I would like to thank the organizers of today's event for including us in your celebration. Today's program honors the 375-year history of the Newman Congregational Church, and the earlier part of that history is intimately entwined with that of the town of Rehoboth, Massachusetts, which is also celebrating its anniversary this year. I'd like to thank the church for sending a nice float to our parade. I find it a little disorienting to reflect that here in East Providence, Rhode Island, I am standing in the original settlement of Rehoboth. Today's program is called On This Land, Exploring Change and Continuity on This Piece of the Earth. 375-year period, of course, is not geologically significant. This land has existed since the world was made and has been shaped over the millennia by continental drift, changing climates and sea levels, glaciers, and the evolution of the plants and animals that live on it. For a relatively short period, it has also been altered by the actions of the various peoples who have lived here. My assignment today is to look briefly at the period that began with the arrival of English-speaking people who kept written records. We'll pay particular attention to the shifting political boundaries that make researching local history such an interesting challenge. Did you know that during the last 375 years, while remaining on approximately the same piece of land, this church has been part of 2 English colonies, 2 of the United States, and 3 towns? The first Englishman known to have settled here was William Blackstone in 1635. He was an eccentric and reclusive Church of England clergyman who farmed and raised apple trees in what is now Cumberland, but showed no interest in establishing a town. Roger Williams was also here briefly, following his banishment from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636. He may have hoped this was far enough away to be beyond any colonial jurisdiction, but the Plymouth authorities soon warned him to move on. He crossed the Seekonk River and founded Providence. Later arrivals, however, came to establish a community here. By the late 1630s, the initial settlements at Plymouth, Salem, and Boston had given rise to many new towns along the coast, and settlements were spreading inland. This was the period known as the Great Migration, and the movement of English families across the Atlantic was driven largely by religion. As you probably know, England had gone through generations of turmoil as Henry VIII and his successors dragged the country back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. By the 1600s, the compromised Church of England was firmly established, but the country was still bitterly divided between those who felt that the state church was too Protestant and those who felt that it was not Protestant enough. Kings and their archbishops enforced elaborate rituals and persecuted dissenters who wanted a plainer, purified church. Separatists fled to Holland and then across the ocean in 1620. Puritan-leaning clergymen and their supporters held out for a time, but from 1630 to the mid-1640s, they came to New England by the thousands. More people meant more towns and more opportunities for jurisdictional conflicts. This area on the edge of Plymouth Colony was also claimed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Additionally, it was sometimes considered to be connected to Roger Williams' settlement of Providence, just across the river. Thus, Rehoboth began in a sort of territorial limbo. In fact, it is an often overlooked fact that the territory seems to have been purchased twice by different people from Chief Massasoit, also known as Osamequin. A man named John Hazel testified that he and others had purchased the land in the late 1630s at the home of Roger Williams for 10 fathoms of wampum and a coat. Plymouth Colony, on the other hand, asserted its claim in 1641 by authorizing John Brown and Edward Winslow to act as purchasers on behalf of that colony. Neither of these original deeds remains in existence, but the 1641 transaction was later acknowledged in a quitclaim deed from King Philip. The initial extent of the town was about 10 miles square and included the present towns of Rehoboth, Seekonk, almost all of East Providence, and about half of Pawtucket. The organizational meeting of the new town, initially called by the Wampanoag name of Seekonk, took place in Weymouth on the 24th of October, 1643, and that is now observed as the founding date of Rehoboth. Over the next several months, 58 heads of families set up a government and laid out house lots around a common with the meeting house in the center of town, right about here. So who were these people and what brought them here? Some of them, at least, having left England for religion, likely now came here in order to have a chance at more land than was available in the more settled towns. Interestingly enough, most of them were not inhabitants of Plymouth Colony, but came from Hingham and Weymouth in the Massachusetts Bay. They may have hoped to be under that colony's jurisdiction. Massachusetts certainly tried to claim the new town. Plymouth objected, however, the matter went to court, and Seekonk, now called Rehoboth, was an undisputed part of Plymouth Colony beginning in 1645. That is the reason that 1645 is sometimes given as Rehoboth's founding year, although not by us here. New England towns were often settled by a group of church members and their minister, and this was the case with Rehoboth. The spiritual leader of the town was Samuel Newman, formerly the pastor of the Weymouth Church, many of whose members came to Rehoboth with him. Newman is also often credited with choosing the name Rehoboth, the Hebrew and biblical roots of which mean an open area, often near water. The location of the town on a large open plain within a bend of the 10-mile river made this a fitting name. The first step in establishing a new town was laying out the house lots around a common with the meeting house in the center. These lots were between 6 and 12 acres in size, with one end at the common and the other end of most at a river or stream. On these lots were the houses, outbuildings, and kitchen gardens. Each proprietor also held other lots scattered throughout the town. Woodlots for the essential firewood and building material, and meadows and salt marsh for corn and hay. This work of dividing land ownership, building permanent houses, and erecting fences to keep the livestock out of the cornfields made for some significant changes to the way the land looked and was used. There were others. Rehoboth's first residents all had to be farmers to survive, but they were busy entrepreneurs as well. Streams were dammed to power sawmills for timber and grist mills for corn. Fish were trapped for use or sale. By 1670, there were warehouses and wharves on the saltwater cove that later became Omega Pond. Ferries crossed the Seekonk River at narrow points, and Rehoboth proprietors traded with Providence and with the natives at Mount Hope. And they bought land. By locating in an area somewhat removed from other English towns, Rehoboth's citizens found opportunities to expand their holdings into adjacent areas. Already in 1645, men from Rehoboth had bought Wannamoiset, kind of the riverside area, and in 1653 they purchased the Soams territory as well. These purchases were first governed from Rehoboth and then became the separate town of Swansea in 1667, accommodating the Baptist followers of John Miles. Swansea initially included what are now Swansea and Somerset, most of Warren, Barrington, and Riverside. Rehoboth's townspeople also looked northwards. In 1661, the Sachem Wamsutta sold them a large tract north of town. This was known as the Rehoboth North Purchase and later as Attleboro. It was named for the town of Attleboro, which is close to Hingham in Norfolk, England. Many of Rehoboth's original settlers came from that area. Attleboro was set off as a separate town in 1694. As well as the present city of Attleboro, it included North Attleboro, Cumberland, and part of Woonsocket, as well as a small strip of what are now Mansfield and Taunton. So Rehoboth had a huge sphere of influence. All these land purchases obviously meant that the native people were left with smaller and smaller areas in which to live. In theory, the two groups were supposed to be able to coexist, and the courts gave legal protection to both English and Wampanoag. But in practice, there are different expectations of land use, the tendency of imported livestock to damage the local cornfields, and the ever-growing numbers of English settlers made for an increasingly uneasy peace, which came to an end in 1675 with the outbreak of King Philip's War on the southern edge of Rehoboth. Rehoboth saw both the beginning and the end of the war. In June, a Swansea farmer killed a Wampanoag on his land, and the following day, Philip and his warriors attacked Swansea in large numbers. They also moved into the sparsely settled Palmer's River settlement in what is now southern Rehoboth, burning houses and a mill and killing inhabitants. Surviving settlers took refuge in garrison houses. Colonial troops headed for Swansea and Rehoboth, and fighting continued for several weeks before moving to other areas. It returned to Rehoboth in March of 1676, when Philip and his men burned virtually all of the houses around the ring of the town, that is to say the area around the original town common, right near here. According to legend, Philip watched the town burn while sitting in an armchair taken from the Abel House on what is now Greenwood Avenue. The end of the war came in August that year, after Philip's death, when Chief Anawan and the last of Philip's men were captured in what is now called Anawan Rock in Rehoboth. The war was a major turning point in the history of Rehoboth and of New England generally, as any attempt at bicultural government was abandoned. Many of the surviving natives were sold into slavery, and the remainder lost most of their land. The English victors were almost starting over in a devastated town. Nearly every building had been burned, crops and livestock were gone, and about 10% of the population had died of attack or disease. Outward expansion ceased for years as the town was slowly rebuilt. The population grew again, however, and between 1684 and 1737, continued land divisions led to the settlement of virtually all of the town in a transformation comparable to the post-World War II building boom. Trees were cut on a massive scale for shipyards and house building, and the cleared land became farms. For much of the century leading up to the Revolutionary War, the available land could accommodate the local young men growing up and wanting their own farms. During this period, in 1692, Plymouth Colony, the old colony, ceased to exist when it was absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay, thus putting Rehoboth into its second colony. After Attleboro was set off, 2 years later, the town of Rehoboth was back to approximately its original size. That was still a large town. As the population of the eastern part of town increased, families complained about the distance they had to travel to get here on Sundays, and in 1711, inhabitants of the neighborhood of Palmer's River petitioned for the town to be divided into two precincts. Although there were objections from the people in the western part of the town, who seem to have disliked the fact that the townspeople would now have to pay for the support of 2 ministers, a second meeting house was built in 1718 on what is now Lake Street in Rehoboth. Yet another border change took place in 1747. Ownership of the eastern side of Narragansett Bay had been periodically contested because of conflicting royal grants. Plymouth Colony was supposed to extend to the water, but Rhode Island had a charter that gave it 3 miles on each side of the bay. Now, Bristol, Warren, and Barrington were annexed to Rhode Island. Taunton thus became the county seat of Bristol County, Massachusetts, because Bristol wasn't in Massachusetts anymore. Oddly enough, the Wannamoisett territory was separated from Barrington at this point and returned to Rehoboth. That is the riverside section of East Providence today. As the century wore on, Rehoboth was affected, like the rest of the colonies, by the imposition of taxes on documents, teas, and so on. By the time the Revolution began, a network of signal beacons had been set up to give warning of military action, and these signals sent Rehoboth Minutemen to Lexington and elsewhere. To imagine these signals in action, you need to remember that the town was much less wooded than it is now. So much land had been cleared for farms and timber that a fire on a hilltop could be seen for miles. Some 1,400 Rehoboth men participated in the Revolutionary War. In the aftermath, the town was part of an independent state rather than a British colony. But its people suffered in the severe economic depression that affected most of the new country. Jay's Rebellion in 1786 evidently met with sympathy here, as a majority voted that year to pursue a change in the government of the Commonwealth. Matters gradually improved, particularly in the western part of town, which had rivers suited to both navigation and industry. During the 1790s, the 2 ferries, which had long operated between Rehoboth and Providence, were replaced by bridges which facilitated trade with Rhode Island. And at the end of the decade, the Industrial Revolution began in the mills run by Samuel Slater and others in the Pawtucket villages of both Providence and Rehoboth. In fact, Pawtucket Village grew so rapidly that in 1828 it was set off as the town of Pawtucket, Massachusetts. Away from the river, however, the town's economy was primarily farm-based, and most people lived at a subsistence level. The remaining big boundary changes came during the 19th century. In May of 1811, there occurred what is known as the Fighting Town Meeting. The purpose of the meeting was ostensibly a decision about how many representatives Rehoboth should send to the state legislature, but it became a stage for the rivalry between sections of town. The growing economic disparity between East and West had led to some residents of the eastern part of the town feeling that they were being shortchanged. As early as 1795, the Palmas River neighborhood had petitioned to be incorporated as a separate town. In 1811, hostility between factions was such that fistfights broke out at the meeting, and 2 attempts at a town meeting dissolved in chaos. The following year, the town of Rehoboth was divided into eastern and western halves. The eastern part kept the name Rehoboth, and the western part, containing the original settlement of the town, resumed the old name of Seacon. The Newman Church was now based in its second town. You're keeping track, right? Finally, in 1862, the states of Rhode Island and Massachusetts settled that long-running border dispute. In an exchange that must have seemed like a good deal to the folks in Boston, part of Tiverton was annexed to the industrial powerhouse of Fall River, while Pawtucket, Massachusetts, and the half of Seacon containing 2/3 of the property valuation and more than 2/3 of the population were carved off and given to Rhode Island. This division evidently still rankled 30 years later when Rehoboth was celebrating its 250th anniversary. A book published at that time states that it was, quote, an act justified by no sound policy, private or public, nor by any substantial claim of title, either in history or justice, end quote. Well, nevertheless, here we are in East Providence, Rhode Island, the second state and third town in which this church has been based while remaining in one place. I think Rehoboth has adjusted to its present borders and to its farming heritage. We wish you well and congratulate you. Still here as a congregation after 375 years. Thank you. I don't think we have a lot of time for questions, right?
We're running a little late. I think we should probably move on, but I would, you know, there'll be plenty of time at the end too, if folks are able to hang around and talk to Rebecca and Linda and Nancy. So please do. Thank you very much. It's very informative. Thank you.
Welcome to Newman Congregational Church. As you can imagine, we're very proud of our 375-year history. From our first pastor, Samuel Newman, to our current pastor, Timothy Sylvia, we have been a major physical and spiritual presence on this corner. Samuel Newman came to America from England, where he had been educated at Oxford University and been a pastor in Yorkshire for 5 years. He left his country because of the persecution of his fellow Puritans and settled with his family in Massachusetts. He came down to us from Weymouth, where he had been called to minister a church in which 3 pastors claimed the pulpit. Disliking controversy, he found the situation intolerable and started looking for greener pastures. So he and about 55 followers discovered a piece of land called Seacon, or Black Duck, as the Indians called it, which was located between the Palmer and Seacon rivers. This area was about 10 miles square and was purchased from Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoags, for 10 fathoms of wampum and a coat. I think this kind of goes along with Rebecca's. Newman renamed the land Rehoboth from a passage in Genesis, meaning the Lord has made room for us. The land was divided into lots and houses were built on what was called the Ring of the Green, where all fences joined to form a common grazing area for cattle. The first meeting house was built in 1646 over there and was located in the center of the green across the street where the graveyard now is situated. A second church was built in 1680 and was larger, 26 by 40 feet, with 2 galleries and a steeple. The First Continental Congress in America met here in 1707. That's the second reason. In drawing these, I had no reference, so I had to imagine these. A much larger third meeting house was built in 1718, and the fourth and final one in 1810, with additions later added from 1947 to 1954. So that's our current meeting house. An interesting fact is that all 4 meeting houses have been in the same corner within 100 feet of each other. Yet I've been in 3 towns, Rehoboth, Seacon, and Providence, 2 states, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and 2 countries, Great Britain and the United States. Samuel Newman was a strong leader who established this community among the wilderness. He worked hard not only on his sermons, but in writing a concordance of the Bible, of which we have an edition here in the back of the room. He also toiled on his own farm, as well as taught the children of the area. He was the only schoolmaster. Cotton Mather said of Newman, quote, "He loved his church as if it had been his family, and taught his family as if it had been his church." In 1663, he died, and after several interim ministers, his son Noah Newman was ordained in 1668. Quote, "It was voted that Reverend Noah should have 40 pounds per year and his wood provided for carrying out the ministry among us." Unquote. Noah Newman faced years of Indian troubles with King Philip, son of Massasoit, who after years of peace was afraid his race would be destroyed by the English. Parishioners had to carry guns to church, where the Indians often would show up on the Sabbath to rifle their homes and kill their cattle. In 1676, the Indians crossed the Seacon River and burned all but 2 houses on the green, including the meeting house. Newman's writings and records were all destroyed in this fire. 19 ministers have followed the Newmans, and rather than record and recount each, I will only mention some highlights of interest during their history. Note how many of our streets here in Rumford have been named after them, beginning with Newman Avenue, of course. Thomas Greenwood and his son John added stables to the meeting house and to shelter the horses for those lucky enough to own them. The rest of the members walked through rain, snow, heat, and mud since Sunday service was obligatory. Some would have to spend most of the day doing this. It was during this time, 1700, that money became scarce because of the taxes imposed on the colonists to pay for the French and Indian Wars. Mary Butterworth, wife of the builder of the third meeting house, became the single biggest counterfeiter in New England. She was arrested in 1723, but never convicted because her method of using a piece of muslin was thrown out and burned after the transfer of printing each bill. The carpenters of the third meeting house were probably paid with these counterfeit bills. In 1783, a controversy arose about the matter of singing and use of musical instruments, including, quote, that devil's instrument, the church organ. The singing of psalms was dear to the heart of Puritan saints and prevailed by democratic vote. During John Ellis's tenure, 1785 to 1796, the Baptists moved into our meeting house and blocked him from his pulpit, so that he had to leave worship in private homes. They were objecting to his salary since there were already 7 Baptist churches in Rehoboth by then, and they did not think they should be taxed to pay for a congregational minister also. However, the General Court finally recognized the rights of the church to the meeting house, and the Baptists built another one of their own in 1794. During James Barney's term, 1824 to 1867, temperance became the rule. He also introduced the congregation to missionary works, as well as organized the first Sunday school. When Reverend Leverett Ferris became pastor in 1888, he remodeled the church, raising it 6 feet with a story built beneath for a Sunday school and the facade altered with a central door and porch, replacing the original 3 doors. So today, those were the original 3 doors, but you can see the difference today. With Reverend Frank Crook, the parish house was built. The 300th anniversary of the church was celebrated with speeches and address given at Samuel Newman's grave across the street. Reverend Robert Simonton was pastor, and Newman voted to join 32 other congregational churches in Rhode Island so that it became part of the UCC, the Union of Congregational and Evangelical Reformed Churches. David Shire became our 19th minister and encouraged the congregation to become involved in outreach and service to the community through the fish program, a soup kitchen in Providence, and Habitat for Humanity. The Reverend Mono Pavan served in the ministry at Newman for 4 months as an exchange minister from Sri Lanka. Then Reverend Shire, his wife Callie, and their daughter went on sabbatical to Sri Lanka themselves for 4 months in 1982 and brought back many interesting and inspirational stories. Our 350th anniversary was celebrated in 1993, and we had 650 members then, and were in the first percentile of giving in the UCC across America. Campbell Lovett became Newman's 20th pastor in 1996 and moved into the newly purchased parsonage on Barney Street with his wife and 2 sons. During his years, there was a number of beginnings and accomplishments in the church. Eileen Lovett led the annual Missions Bazaar, with all proceeds going to local and global communities. New bylaws were voted in, and a medical missions team traveled to Haiti and began the long-term relationship with the Mission Evangelique Baptiste Bethesda. September 11, 2001 called for a special service with Hindu, Muslim, and Jewish faiths participating in an effort to gain healing and tolerance. That December, we focused on homelessness with 2 250-pound wooden sculptures named Mona and Joel in front of our church to raise awareness. and outside overnight sleepovers with the youth were transpired. Campbell coached the Newman youth basketball team and built a racetrack for the Pinewood Derby, used by local Cub Scouts. An auction was held for the music. The grounds renovated, and the first Epiphany Tea was held. The Newman News became available by email. The Seacott parsonage sold, and a high-performance organ was installed. The heating system was upgraded with a campaign to finance 2 new gas burners in place of the old oil tank and burner, and a new sound and recording system was installed. In the fall of 2008, Newman officially became an open and affirming church. The Bread of Life Food Pantry opened with the effort of 6 East Providence churches to serve many families in the surrounding area. Our 21st and current pastor, Timothy Sylvia, came to us in 2014. He hit the ground running with his dynamic services and enthusiasm for Newman's future. He was married to his partner, Peter, right here in the sanctuary, a historic first for our church. Besides strongly promoting our open and affirming policy with our rainbow doors, Pastor Timothy has introduced the Nourish program, involving a monthly communal and cooperative dinner and prayerful discussions. He also began, after Communion Sunday brunch, as well as our very successful talent showcase fundraiser. Our Bread of Life Food Pantry continues to reach out to the community every other week, serving some 500 families in the area. We are going on 10 years with this very successful mission, and our Haiti mission is also going strong, providing educational and health support to students in orphanages on that island. Park Place Pawtucket Soup Kitchen also receives our support, as well as many other local organizations through our December Mission Bazaar. Our green team has successfully reached its goal of self-sustaining solar panels attached to the roof of Memorial Hall. Our music program, led by Jeff Green, continues to wow us all, not only on Sundays, but on frequent concert occasions such as today's. All in all, we are a vital church community, having lasted 375 years through strong leadership and an enthusiastic and supportive congregation. Who knew 3 3/4 centuries ago that we'd still be here on this corner, having existed in 2 states, 3 towns, and 2 countries, and starting out as a tiny log cabin across the street.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Linda. I'd love to get follow-ups from each of you to put on the website to kind of summarize today. I have surveys here that we can pass out and pens. We have lots of stuff to check out. We have food and drink, and we have a concert in 45 minutes. I can't thank you all enough for being here. It's been tremendous. Can we please give it up for all the speakers again?